friend of mine, an accomplished peer in our industry, said to me a few weeks ago, in a world where the discussion on equity, diversity, and inclusion has for the past year very necessarily and very appropriately focused on race issues, it's been a challenge to find the bandwidth to have a meaningful discussion on LGBTQ issues. As global destinations return to a much needed, very welcome, but still very tentative reopening, we know a few things from past experience. Our friend Amir Elon at Longwoods has shared with us throughout the pandemic the travel intentions research that indicates short-haul, short-stay vacations will recover first. And our friends at Skift point out that the LGBTQ public will largely be a significant early adopter of both domestic and international traveler. So here's the question. As we deal with becoming an equitable, diverse, and inclusive world on so many fronts, what is authentic destination marketing? Both my guests today have dedicated their careers to bringing equity, diversity, and inclusion into the travel industry. LoAnn Halden is the Communications Director for the International Gay and Lesbian Travel Association. She's a freelance writer-editor, and as far as I can tell, an accomplished foodie. LoAnn has been working in LGBT media since 1995 with an emphasis on travel. She's an author and a regular contributor to an impressive list of international publications. Greg DeShields is the Executive Director of PHL Diversity with the Philadelphia Visitors and Convention Bureau and the Executive Director of Tourism Diversity Matters, and formerly the Managing Director of the Business Development for Temple University's Fox School of Business and School of Tourism and Hospitality Management. Good morning, LoAnn. How are you? Where are you?
Good morning, David. Thanks for having me. I am in sunny Fort Lauderdale, headquarters of IGLTA.
Good morning, Greg DeShields. How are you?
I am doing terrific. Thank you so much, David, for the invitation. And I am in Philadelphia.
All right. So Philadelphia and Florida, how are they rating in the battle to COVID? Where are you guys at right now?
So from Philadelphia's perspective, vaccines are moving along quite nicely. The governors of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey are very anxious to release restrictions and probably will be 100% released, as has been stated, by July 4th, but will be in the 75% by May 19th. As it relates to Philadelphia, it's a little bit slower, but we are beginning to see that there is a release, and I'm sure by the time the other three states have moved into that, Philadelphia won't be far behind it.
Well, that's super encouraging news. I'm always happy to hear those kind of numbers. LoAnn, what about you?
Well, it's Florida, so there's always challenges when you're talking about Florida, right? The vaccines have actually gone fairly well here, and most of the people in my circle are now fully vaccinated. But there's still challenges related to the politics of the state.
For sure. Guys, I want to launch into a broad discussion on equity, diversity, and inclusion, but I think framing it against the backdrop of broader equity, diversity, and inclusion is appropriate, but also drilling into the LGBTQ elements, because that really teaches us something here. Greg, the other day we were having a discussion, and you walked me through a brief overview of sort of the evolution of the LGBTQ travel market. And I think it was really helpful and gave context. And I think you know where I'm going with this, because we've come a long way since 2001. But give us that context again, please, as we look to reopen and we look to capture significant markets authentically.
Well, I think what will certainly resonate is the idea that there's three forms of travel. There's leisure, there's business, and then there's convention. As it relates to the LGBT market, they'll certainly be early adapters and engaging in leisure travel, especially given that a lot of the vaccines and release of the restrictions are taking place at the beginning of the summer. So you'll certainly see a significant amount of LGBT leisure travel that's taking place. And then, of course, followed by corporate, which should help to pick up the slack when leisure begins to die off in the fall. Corporate is typically a pickup towards the fall months. And then as far as meetings are concerned, most may not begin to really take place as we've seen in the past until 2023 or 2024. I think though it's always, important to realize that when you say LGBTQ, that's not just one group, that's lesbian and that's gay. And so as you work your way through it, it's also understanding the nuances of what LGBTQ means. And then layering on top of that, that there are some generational issues in terms of how a boomer LGBT person travels versus a millennial versus a Gen Z. So I would say that, as they've said, it's not a monolith. These are all very different people with all different, travel expectations and travel desires. I think it's fair to say that there still is a fair amount of discretionary dollars that the LGBT community would certainly use during the course of it, but realize that that's not the way the entire LGBT community lives. So there'll be, certainly a number who, like anybody else, are going to look for a good deal and the best experience they can have. So that's maybe the context that I would put it in for everyone.
So when we talked about that before, we went down the path talking about how the evolution from 2000 sort of forward sometimes was a little tone deaf, and you said it very well there. When you take LGBTQ and treat it as a single cohort, you're missing the mark. LoAnn, you look around the world though, there's a lot of marketing targeted at that group that still really does use that 5-letter moniker and doesn't differentiate, isn't there?
It's true. I mean, I think you always have to think about the context of the place, because LGBTQ, or even what the letters that are used to refer to the community, are different depending on what country you're sitting in. But I think one of the areas where we as a community as a whole have actually failed, and it's come to the forefront much more recently with Black Lives Matter and the conversations about race, are that we were looking at it from an insular perspective of, okay, we have to try and remember there's L and G and B and T and Q and plus, but we weren't actually thinking about how that intersected with other races and cultures within the letters of the alphabet soup. So I think there's two parts to this. When destinations are thinking about the LGBTQ plus market, there's thinking about the different letters of that market, but also thinking about the fact that we are an entire rainbow community, and it's not just about looking at white gay men. And you do see that marketing still in immature markets. There are plenty of places in the world where even just talking about gay is still, punishable by death. We have still more than 70 countries in the world that criminalize same-sex relationships. So you always have to take it into context of where you're sitting in the world. I mean, you can't really point too many fingers at someone for being a little bit, immature in their marketing attitudes, because they have a long way to come just to catch up to where we're sitting right here in the United States. I mean, we take a lot of things for granted.
That's well put, and certainly you're absolutely right. There's no finger pointing. There's just the evolution of an inclusive world that can be better for everybody. Talk about that. Let's talk about how to segment. Greg, you talked the other day about authentic LGBT experiences, but you were really clear to identify that the authenticity starts with what the consumer is looking for. So if you are a family gay couple, it makes perfect sense that a family destination makes sense. Do you have more sort of ideas and tips like that for us to help us think in the right context? Because I think sometimes we are just blinded by that LGBTQ banner as if it was going to be a stamp we could put on something and away we go, and we've done our bit.
Well, I think it's fair, though, to put into context when we talk about travel, especially after being in a pandemic for a year. Everybody wants the same thing. Everybody, whether they're gay, straight, black, white, whatever, they all want to get away, right? Travel is all about an experience. It's doing something that in a lot of cases that people just haven't done in the last year. And I think that if we were to think in terms of the LGBT community or any other community, we all want the same thing. We want to eat, we want to shop, we want to stay in a nice hotel, we want to visit different type of venues and destinations. So all, consumers, traveling consumers would want that. I think the issue of authenticity around your destination is also taking into account that perhaps you do have a gay couple who is staying at your hotel. They are definitely going to go out. They are definitely going to get coffee, pick up a newspaper, but there may be other aspects that how they identify themselves as gay that they may prefer to or have a desire to shop in a certain shop that certainly has products and services that might be specifically of interest to the LGBT community, whether they have unique rainbow flags or rainbow t-shirts or something like that. So I think having that kind of authentic connection by having LGBT businesses in your community, I think the other idea is that as individuals are visiting your destination, that it's not just your bureau that is defining it as a gay-friendly community. Your business community, your policing community, your transport, everyone should support that as those visitors are in your destination. And that's where the authenticity of it begins to surface. But realize that there are, still going to be some unique things. Of course, they want to go out like anybody would want to go out, but their preference may be to go to a gay bar than to a straight bar or something along that lines. I think it's just having the ability to deliver any customer a great experience and realize that there are nuances associated with the experience that a gay traveler may want to have. But I think realizing that you can't necessarily promise it without knowing that your destination can't deliver it.
Greg, you've been working at PHL Diversity on specifically that engagement piece. When you talked about, your mayor should echo that, your firefighters should echo that. That is a key part of your day-to-day work, isn't it? Is building that network of understanding and consensus and representation.
It is. So we work very closely with our LGBT chamber, as well as all of our other ethnic chambers and our main chamber. We work very closely with the mayor's office of LGBT affairs because they really help to create the linkage of how, in fact, we can gain the support of the police. In terms of ensuring that if we have a trans group that's in Philadelphia, that it's going to be safe, that there'll be police patrolling. We also work very closely with our restaurant community to make sure that the restaurants are going to be welcoming if we do have a trans convention in Philadelphia, and that they make the appropriate accommodations in terms of gender neutral bathrooms. We work with our hotel partners, providing them educational programming. So it is, I hate to use the phrase a village, but everybody has to come together that this is important to us as a destination. And it certainly is not just going to generate room nights, but it's going to generate, restaurant covers. It's going to create people buying things in stores. It's people going to museums. But that level of welcoming and engagement has to truly be something that everybody's on the same page with when you're engaging the community.
So, LoAnn, when you look at the model of engaged destinations that authentically have positioned themselves in the LGBT market because they believe in the equity and diversity, not just because they're looking for customers per se, but that's always a consideration in tourism, is we need to make cash registers ring to make the lives of citizens enriched in order to sustain tourism. But when you look around the world and you listen to what Greg's talking about in terms of building that network and aligning those stakeholders, can you think of some illuminating ideas for us, places that you admire for the work on this front that you could share with us?
Well, I mean, I'd certainly be remiss if I didn't tip my hat to Philadelphia, because they've certainly done the work for a very long time. And, looking around the US, Los Angeles, New York City, I mean, they've done an incredible job. In smaller markets here in Florida, Fort Lauderdale has done an incredible job in their development, particularly in outreach to transgender travelers, which is one of the most overlooked segments within our community. Looking around the world globally, I mean, there are actually quite a lot of them. Iceland has been a really interesting example of inclusivity because it's just part of their DNA. Everything that they do is about DEI. there are obvious destinations, but I'm trying to think of some of the less obvious ones. It's been great to see the work happening in Japan, actually. So that's a place that doesn't have fully developed rights for the LGBTQ plus community, but then you see specific cities like Osaka and Kyoto that are really working with their stakeholders and providing education, because that's really the key. If you're going to engage your stakeholders and you're going to be an authentic destination, you have to look internally. You have to work from within and make sure that everyone understands the market that they're trying to reach. So I've seen some of these unexpected destinations really go the extra mile and provide workshops and webinars on LGBTQ plus diversity, education, and marketing, so that they know that their community businesses really understand what it means to authentically welcome a traveler. And I think that's essential for any destination, is to do that work.
Thank you. Greg, you sit on Diversity Matters with, actually, you are the Executive Director of Diversity Matters, along with Mike Gamble from Searchwide. I was talking to Mike a week ago, and much similar, very similar to the conversation I had with the two of you, in this equity, diversity, and inclusion crisis. And it is this in the world. And certainly it was amplified to an absolute level we've never seen in the United States last summer, and it's a painful thing that we all have to deal with. There is opportunity, according to Mike, especially in tourism, at the board level. And we look at our representative boards and we see a fairly homogenous mix of pinkish color there. Mike challenges us all that it's time to look at the EDI perspective, look at the board from the EDI perspective, and make sure our boards represent the people who make up our visitors and travelers. What do you want to say to that?
So, I think the issue with boards are also centered upon the core values of how the organization was established, and looking at, as an organization, the culture that they create. So the reality of it is, a lot of organizations are not diverse because they didn't plan on being diverse. And now they are evolving, and the environment of being a business competitor to realize that that's important. But that means that those organizations are going to have to look at, are we in fact embracing this as a shared value? And that may be a real challenge for a lot of organizations. And that's why boards have struggled to make the kind of adaptation that they probably should. There are some people who've sat on boards far longer than they should, and they should make way that seat for someone who's going to move the organization forward. I think then you begin to create an environment where the culture of the organization can change. Because at the board level, if I'm insisting that we don't have a diversity initiative, we have a diversity committee, and that's a standing committee, just as finance, just as programs, or whatever you want to call it, from the board level. And whoever's on the board is going to be the chair of that particular committee. And that person is going to report out the progress and the success of it, and how it is within the overall organization's strategic plan that then has a cascading DEI strategic plan within the organization. But that kind of work is still something that a lot of organizations have to put their arm around, because for some, it's going to be like moving from a gasoline engine to a hybrid electric engine. And there are pieces that are in that engine that don't fit in this new model. And organizations are going to have to make some hard decisions about, okay, we've got 34 members on the board. How many of those are probably folks who have had their terms, and that there's probably time for some new terms to be executed that would move our organization forward towards being more diverse and inclusive?
Well, and I think Mike put it well, which is it's an opportunity. It's something that if you ignore it, you miss the opportunity. LoAnn, what do you have to say about the constitution of the hierarchies in business around tourism and travel?
Well, it's interesting because this is actually something we're going through at IGLTA as well. And if you look at our 38-year history, we started as IGTA, and then it took you more than a decade to become IGLTA. And now we're actually the International LGBTQ plus Travel Association. So we've had to do our own work from within. And we have our association board, and then we have our nonprofit foundation board. And since our members sit in all different sectors of tourism, destinations, travel agents, tour operators, accommodations, transportation, and then they sit all over the world, And then we're also looking at gender equity and orientation. So we're trying to cross section with all of these different sets. And that's something that we really actively work to expand upon. So one of the things that we're launching this year is a transgender advisory group for our IGLTA Foundation, because that's the other thing. It's very difficult to attract the right people if you don't reflect the group you're trying to attract.
Well, you say that, and that really pings something that Bill Geist and Mike Gamble said to me, because I was talking to them about this episode and getting some intelligence. The Gen Z cohort, and again, we're not trying to stick people in cohorts today, but the Gen Z cohort, and I think of my own 23, 24-year-old daughter, who really, it warms my heart to say, doesn't see color, doesn't see sexuality, doesn't see religion, and gets annoyed at me when my eyebrows goes up in my 1963 old white guy kind of way sometimes. It's magnificent to think that, in 10 years, that can be a pervasive view in our society, that she really, it's not just that she won't see it, but she will only react to places that share that value. And I don't mean virtues, broadcasting and sharing, but she's looking for an employer that's diverse, that's inclusive, that's open. I think the other thing that Bill said to me was, in attracting the Gen Z cohort to work for us, which we will be doing more and more over the next 10 years. We are starting to recruit them in earnest right now. They are just old enough for that, coming out of college, that's going to shape and change the diversity on our boards and our organizations as well, because they will be looking for organizations that demonstrate their values without preaching them.
So, it's interesting. I did an interview with the president of an organization called Work with Gen Z, and they do nothing but Gen Z. Gen Z is age 9 to 26 for context. And Gen Z will represent 40% of your employees and 40% of your customers. And Gen Z grew up with diversity. So Gen Z are really annoyed at organizations that try and push a DEI agenda in terms of securing them as talent. And I think, to your point, as Gen Z continues to infiltrate the work environment, it will begin to have a significant shift. Millennials led that effort, and millennials are in the hiring and the leadership roles that are embracing that 40% of Gen Z. So between millennial and Gen Z, it is conceivable that you could see that overall shift of work environment to be much more inclusive. But there is still within the structure of a lot of organizations at higher levels a need to do the internal work.
Greg, thanks for that. And the reference you made was to your friend Pranam Lipinski.
Yeah, yeah.
And his book was called Working with Gen Z, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic book. You turned me on to him, and I had a great chat with him. He will come on the show and talk about Gen Z. Yeah, and it's great. And I do this all the time. It's great when you see patterning, because just the same way we look at Europe and European cities marketing for the pressures and results of over tourism, which has helped us a lot in COVID. It's helped us think about how we rebuild, how we become more relevant. Similarly, looking at the Gen Z comparison can help us forward with our EDI visioning to say, okay, but look 15 years in the future. What's this going to be? How do we get there? For sure. Go ahead, LoAnn.
Well, I was going to say, it's been seen in the evolution, particularly in mature markets, of how marketing outreach, not just internally, but externally, has become so much more inclusive, because it's not so much about the separation. It's not so much about always having to have the rainbow flag on everything. And it's much more about seeing yourself represented in marketing across all platforms. Whereas globally, in the less mature markets, then we still see that need for identification, the need to be able to spot the rainbow flag and know that's where you can congregate with like-minded individuals. Yeah. So we're light years ahead.
Yeah, and indeed. To that end, we did have this discussion, the three of us. I touched on it a couple of weeks ago. I saw some amazing work out of Helsinki, who took their Helsinki in a Box marketing campaign, which was meant to attract talent, and started doing something that I haven't seen in years, which was really broad scale values-based marketing, why you should come to Helsinki. And it was a series of values that people stated on the street, things they cared about. And it was impossible not to resonate with those values. Didn't matter if they were black, white, straight, gay. It was like, it literally made me say, I want to go back to Helsinki. It's been almost a decade. It's time to go back. I was shocked and awed because we've been in a verticals marketing mode for almost 2 decades here, where we're getting better at finding mountain bikers and gourmands and people who like carp fishing. And so it's really good to see that as we want to include more equity and diversion, it's not about targeting groups and verticals. It's about opening up our principles and values and making people understand that we share these values regardless of who we are.
Mhm.
Yeah, and we talked about that a bit previously in our conversation too, David, in that it's really about the DNA of the destination and whatever that means. You're not trying to be all things for all people, but you are trying to welcome all people and make them feel like they're safe to have whatever experience they want to have there.
Mhm.
Well, and I think I see some really great work, and literally, I will say, just starting to come out of Europe. I'm looking at the work in Brussels and Helsinki. If people want to take a look around, they are really shifting towards, as my friend Elke Dens from Flanders said, marketing to all humanity. It's been a long time since I heard that term. So here we go. If I'm going to put you both on the spot. What's your favorite ice cream?
Butter pecan.
What's that?
Butter pecan.
Right on.
So this is a wacky answer, but a friend of mine just made homemade ice cream and it was the best I'd ever had in my life. It was fig and goat cheese.
I could get interested. I said you were a foodie, didn't I?
You did. You set it up for that perfectly.
Your first foodie book came out in 2005, I think.
Well, you'd apparently know better than I did.
It was a Miami food guide.
A restaurant guide to Miami. That's true. You really dug into the archives for that, didn't you?
I can get up for food. All right, no, more serious question to both of you. Seriously, I really appreciate you coming on today, and you have so much to share with an industry that is in flux, and that flux is always difficult, but it's time to grow. And I think we really do come out of this crisis globally in a better place with a higher value on people and the interconnectedness of people. So knowing that, if you have one thing that you could share with your peers as they look to the summer, and you guys know what that looks like, a stalled recovery, stops and starts, on again, off again marketing, into the fall with a much higher compliance rate on the vaccinations, and maybe rolling into, cross your fingers, a normative spring, for next year. What do you want to share? What do we need to work on? What should we pay attention to? It's very easy to get, caught up, putting gas in the car and the basics, but you got to remember to change the tires. You got to remember the other things, the hard things to work on that aren't apparent. What should we be working on?
Well, the amazing thing about tourism has always been its ability to bring people together and create understanding and awareness across borders and across cultures. This pandemic has created so much isolation. Now is really the time for the tourism industry to double down on creating a sense of inclusion for all travelers. I think we really need to focus more than anything on making everyone feel welcome to explore this crazy, beautiful planet of ours.
Well said.
I agree 100% with that. I think it's really going to be important for destinations to be mindful that everyone wants to travel, everyone wants to get away, and any business that's not thinking in terms of, those who live in very prestigious suburban communities and very rural communities, we all have the same desire to get out and do something different. I think it's important for destinations to not sell itself for something that it's not. And I really want to lean into that idea of authenticity. And I think, there are a number of very desirable stories that, those who speak for your community could be a part of campaigns to bring people to those destinations. And I think it's telling stories, it's getting, authentic voices to encourage people to want to visit. So I would take a different approach and not try and, map out a regular cookie cutter campaign, but be much more focused on providing folks who have been pent up for a year the desire to go out and hear from folks who probably had the same experience why they should go to their destination. You know, there was one thing we didn't talk about, and I do think it's important to be sure to mention it. You know, there are issues of racism and discrimination within the LGBT community. And as you look at, you know, a lot of the challenges that the Black and Brown trans community has experienced, it's evident that, you know, issues of racism are not just isolated in one space. It cuts across all society. I think it's really important to take note that in Philadelphia, there was a campaign to move forward to add a Black and brown stripe to the flag to really show more inclusivity. And for many, especially LGBT travelers of color, Black and brown, they look for a rainbow flag that has a Black and brown stripe to determine how inclusive that community is. So there are also that aspects within the LGBT community, which is important. And I would not want some to think that a general campaign that's targeted to a white cisgendered person or a white LGBT person would have the same way of resonating to a Latino or an African American. It's, you know, it's that nuanced, and I would just be mindful of that, but especially over the last few years with the addition of the Black and brown stripe, because it adds another layer of being inclusive.
Well, I got to say, thank you both. You've dedicated your careers to this immensely important part of our lives, and I really do appreciate it, Ernest, and I thank you for that. And I hope you come back and talk to us again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.